In your Forbes piece last month, you delved into the Trump administration's new budget, slashing domestic public investments by hundreds of billions of dollars. What can you tell us about the current administration's priorities based on the fiscal year 2027 federal budget request?
Yes, and people should really subscribe to Stephen Semler's newsletter because he does this stuff like that. Um, but for example, the first year of the war, first week of the war against Iran, by one measure, cost about $12 billion. And the Trump administration's proposal for the whole year for the Centers for Disease Control and Environmental Protection Agency is $8 billion, the whole year to fund those two agencies. So we spent more on a week of a war that should never have been fought than we spend on the agencies that are supposed to be on the front lines against climate change and pandemics, which have killed many more Americans than the wars of the last century. So our whole idea of security is skewed, and I think also our strategy is, uh, military overreach and not learning from history, because we have not won a war in this century. We had superior technology, but it didn't achieve U.S. objectives. And in the case of Iran, they're saying, well, we can't let Iran have a nuclear weapon. Well, there was an agreement that had effectively prevented that, which President Trump abandoned, saying he could do better. And the better ends up being a Mideast wide war. So all of these hawks who say we cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, as far as they don't, uh, and they're far from it, much less a missile to deliver it. But also, where were they when we had an agreement? Trump said it was Obama's agreement, but it was not. It was the European Union, major European powers, China, Russia, and the United States and Iran. There hasn't been an agreement like that where all those powers agree in a long, long time. It had inspections and it was one of the more intrusive regimes. The other side's argument was what happens 15 years from now if there's a loosening of restrictions? Well, in 15 years, that's a lifetime. There could be a different government. We could have continuing negotiations. And they also make it sound like as soon as they have enough uranium to build a bomb, it's all over. Well, to get from there to a bomb that's miniaturized, that's attached to a missile that can go 6,000 miles, could be many additional years. So when Bibi Netanyahu got in front of the Congress and had this little thermometer showing how close Iran was to a bomb, it was utter nonsense. And he knew that. I mean, his goal is to uh, rope the U.S. into overthrowing the Iranian regime. And Donald Trump was the first one to fall for it. I mean, even George W. Bush's folks were like, we don't want to do that. So, yeah, so, um, I think that you got the cuts in the social programs, which go deeper than anything in living memory. I mean, they're touching things that they normally would not have gone after. But for example, veterans are going to have fewer clinics, less support. At the same time, we're saying this is for the troops. There's military families, if you have a large family, on food stamps, while the head of Lockheed Martin makes $20 million a year. Um, I mean, health, education across the board. Stephen figured out that of the new budget, the discretionary budget, which is sort of things other than long term programs like Social Security or Medicare, only about 20% was for domestic needs. Once you dealt with ICE, the Pentagon, nuclear warheads, veterans benefits, which is the cost of less wars, we've whittled it down to that little amount of money. And of course, they destroyed our main economic development agency, AID. And only after was it destroyed did they point out, oh, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people around the world were depending on that for water, for nutrition, for healthcare, because AID has a checkered history. I mean, they used them to plant spies during the Central American Wars. They used them to clean up after wars instead of do new things. They use contractors who abuse it. But there was a core there that was helping people, and they just took a sledgehammer to the whole thing. So now the United States, in addition to attacking international agreements, they've basically narrowed the U.S. tools to one, to the military tool, and it's not working. President Eisenhower is known for the military industrial complex speech, but he also said the grounding of our defense should be a healthy population that's well educated that asks intelligent questions of its government and that has some kind of unity. And within that, yes, you need a national defense. Well, of those five pillars, this administration is savaging four of them. And so we're left with the military option, and the tech folks are saying technology will save us, but it never has. It didn't in Vietnam. It didn't when they built Star Wars. It didn't in Afghanistan or Iraq. I mean, we couldn't have had more of a technological overmatch. I mean, in Iraq, we were defeated by people that were setting off bombs with their phones because it was the wrong mission. Force wasn't going to do it. There was resistance based on the notion that the U.S. was occupiers. People knew the terrain and so forth. So the idea that this next round attack is going to be the one that's the trick. There's no evidence in history that that's the case. And if you, of course, look at the ideologies of the folks who are at the pinnacle of Silicon Valley, they make Lockheed Martin look like a diplomat. You know.
Well, the US prioritizing military funding is nothing new. In your view, how has US military spending evolved over the years? And while you were working to co-author Trillion Dollar War Machine, what did you uncover?
Well, I think the difference now is the severity of it. There's been some ups and downs, but the downs are usually at pivotal historic moments, like the end of the Vietnam War or the end of the Cold War. And then the Pentagon tries to reestablish a rationale. So at the end of the Cold War, they cut pretty substantially, 50% of procurement, a third of the troops. And Colin Powell famously said, this is a slight paraphrase, but I'm running out of enemies here. All I got is Cuba, North Korea, and so they ran with it. And the Pentagon's new strategy was two major regional contingencies, which Michael Clare wrote about in his book, Rogue Nations and Nuclear Outlaws. So basically, they said, okay, we don't have this one big adversary, but what if we have to fight North Korea and Iran or Iraq at the same time? And that became George W. Bush's axis of evil. Well, the answer was we probably won't. And if we did, they're very different powers. They spend a minuscule portion of what we spend. At that time, they didn't have nuclear weapons that could reach us. So a lot of it was demonization in the interest of increasing the budget. Um, but now, President Trump wants to add 500 billion in 1 year, and that 500 billion is larger than the entire military budget of any country in the world, about 60% more than China's annual budget. And much of it will be wasted because any agency can't increase its spending by 50% and do it efficiently. In the case of the military, they don't have the factories, they don't have the skilled workers. So they're either going to squander it. They might as well just send a Venmo to Lockheed Martin and say, have a nice day. Congress will probably chop off a few hundred billion because some of it is through reconciliation. And the last one, which got us the big ugly bill, only passed by one vote in each house. And this war with Iran is so poorly justified. And they want extra money for that, by the way. The 1.5 wouldn't even cover that. That I think their ability to get the 300 billion plus that they want to get through reconciliation will be diminished. So he's asking for 50%. If he gets 20%, some of our Democratic leaders will say, "Oh, we did our job," but their job ended up in a 20% increase in a budget that was already ridiculously high. So the Trump people, in that sense, were savvy that they asked for such a ridiculous number that they were still going to get quite a bit. And there's two factions. There's the big five like Lockheed Martin who make the hardware. There's the Peter Thiels and Elon Musk who make software. But they're either going to do battle or they're going to pay them both off. And so far, pay them both off seems to be the approach. For example, Golden Dome, Lockheed Martin and RTX will make the hardware, and they're talking about either Anduril or SpaceX to be the systems integrator, oversee the software, all for a thing that every physicist who's not on the payroll of the Pentagon or the industry says is impossible. President Trump's leak-proof missile defense. Because, for example, an ICBM warhead comes in at 15,000 miles an hour. In space, you can surround it with painted balloons that look like warheads. So if there's 100 of those things, each with 100 things that might be warheads, all coming at the same time, there's no way you're going to stop them all. When they do a test, they announce when they're launching it. Russia would not do that. They wouldn't call up and say, "Oh, we're launching the missiles now." And they've never done a test against decoys. So there's no proof that this would work, and yet this administration is willing to spend somewhere between 300 billion and 2.6 trillion on this. I don't think it'll get that far, but there will be significant amounts of money wasted when they say we don't have a dime to spend because we have to build artillery. Of course, we're out of artillery because we're fighting wars we never should have fought. So essentially, they're failing upward. They say, well, we need more, a bigger arms industrial base because all the wars we fought have failed and we've spent all this money. Well, of course, another approach would be fight fewer wars, have a diplomatic approach, use more tools to exert influence. And they have decided against that in a big way, and we're paying the price.
You often talk about the fallacy of the jobs argument. Could you explain that and what else you think Americans misunderstand when it comes to US military spending and where their taxpayer dollars are going?
Yeah, well, one way to look at it is job blackmail. We'll give you $1 billion to build a submarine, or we'll give you nothing. You choose. Whereas if you invested money in climate, infrastructure, education, healthcare, Heidi Peltier at the Cost of War Project estimates you would get anywhere from 9% to 250% more jobs, many of them just as well paying. But people aren't being given that choice because Washington's not investing in climate. They did under Biden, and they're trying to roll that back. So, if I'm in at the electric boat plant in Connecticut, I'm a machinist. I can either work on the submarine or I could try to get a job as a greeter at the casino for close to minimum wage. But if we had a public investment program for things we need, dealing with pandemics and climate, updating our infrastructure. I mean, if you go almost anywhere in the world and see just their public parks, their infrastructure, countries that allegedly the U.S. is lording it over in terms of the size of our GDP, have far better infrastructure than we do. And it's not just China. Trevor Noah, when he first went on the Daily Show as a guest, showed a picture of two highways. One was pockmarked and cars were barely surviving. The other was a superhighway. So the superhighway was Nigeria, and the pockmarked one was the FDR Drive in Manhattan. And he said, "Which country would you like to live in?" So it's not maybe quite that extreme, but we're undermining the basis of our economy, which eventually will undermine your ability to defend yourself. Um, so on the jobs front, if we invested in other things, we would have more jobs. And also, a lot of these programs now are international. So I did a piece on the F-35, and there were more jobs in companies making discrete components in Italy, UK, than there were in the US. Italy has an assembly plant. Japan assembles engines. BAE has a huge chunk of it. So there's these 9 partner nations that got in on the ground floor, all of whom have jobs from this. And the jobs can't be in both places. So if they come here and say, oh, there's all these jobs, then they go to Italy, there's all these jobs, UK, there's all these jobs. Well, no, they're the same jobs. They're dividing them up over a larger scope. And these are things that are almost like craft. They make 120, not hundreds of thousands or millions like cars. So it's primarily engineers. It's not production workers. Taylor Barnes has found that although this used to be a heavily unionized sector, that was of the past. I mean, Northrop Grumman is 7% unionized. And they've moved to the right to work states that oppose unions, like South Carolina. They put the F-16 to curry favor with Lindsey Graham. So, and then the tech revolution, they're not even pretending there's going to be a lot of jobs. I mean, the data centers will be construction jobs. And by one accounting, you could run them with 6 people once they're up and running. And they haven't told us where they're going to build these things. Musk built his cars in China. Many of them use child labor around the world for their electronics. They act like they're selling us ideas. Well, no, these ideas have to be translated into reality. So Anduril is building a plant in Ohio, coincidentally or not, the home state of J.D. Vance, who's a big promoter of Silicon Valley. And there's a lot of local opposition for all different reasons. Uh, Farmers, people concerned about energy use, and so forth. Meanwhile, they're a partial sponsor of the Ohio State football team, which is another thing that's kind of branding. Like, well, hey, I've got a tech company supporting me. So maybe they'll play with robots. Who knows? Which would reduce injuries. But anyway, so yeah, the job outlook, as it was, Taylor, who's a brilliant researcher, found out from the industry that 40 years ago there were 3 million jobs producing weapons, direct hands-on production, and now that's 1.1 million, even though we're spending more because of outsourcing and automation, and they're trying to learn how to uh, make spare parts through 3D printing, which also reduces, and a lot of it, there's price gouging and there's money that doesn't really go. I mean, the 100 lobbyists, how much does it cost to sustain them? That's probably the least jobs per billion of any job. Um, and the $20 million salaries and the companies bidding up their stock prices. So there's a lot of money sloshing around that never makes it to any worker of any sort. So the problem is, what's your choice? And if we never have a policy to invest in other things, then there's still going to be a fight to keep these factories. Miriam Pemberton found that a lot of the places that have heavy concentrations of military production have worse than average poverty rates because they're like these little bubbles and they don't really radiate even to the region. And so what we really need is not like Lockheed Martin making air conditioners. We need regional economies that create a similar number of jobs as these companies that have a more distributed kind of employment that meets the needs of a broad range of people and so forth. So uh, it's really, if you don't tackle that, you end up with a situation where the Pentagon can't even get rid of weapons it doesn't want. They want to get rid of the littoral combat ship because it can't defend itself. And the people in Florida and Virginia, the members, they weren't even building them there; they were repairing them there. Said, no, you can't do that. So they made them keep 5 of them out of the 9 that they wanted to retire. And that means they have to maintain them, they have to have crew. And so even if you were kind of like a hard edge militarist, you wouldn't build a system where you can only build things that are made in this or that district. It's basically like the Pentagon budget is like a sedimentary rock. Nothing ever goes away. There's the old stuff that Congress won't let you leave. And then if they want to do new stuff, they could do it on top of that, like all this tech. So that's why we're at $1 trillion, because they never make choices. They want us to make choices, but they do not make choices.
So, what are your policy recommendations now? And who do you think might forward them given likely opposition from the Trump administration?
Well, I think we need new policies and we need a culture shift. Policies, there's some good folks like Ro Khanna, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mark Pocan, but they were talking about $100 billion cut in Pentagon spending. But since they started that initiative, it's gone up many multiples of that. So we may have to rethink that number. But what you really need is, how do you get rid of stuff we don't need? How do you have a coherent strategy? And Congress isn't good at that. I mean, they had a commission on nuclear posture, and the hearing literally was just members touting weapons in their state. They didn't talk about how many nukes do we need? Are we getting life as we know it? Senator Warren said, well, just out of curiosity, what is this going to cost? And the co-chair, who was a former lobbyist for Northrop Grumman, said, oh, cost is no object. This is too important. And so we need to hold the feet of Congress to the fire to say, at least, please debate the issues. Talk about what we need to defend ourselves. Talk about the consequences of these wars. Don't just tell us that this magic technology is going to save us when it never has before. And by the way, don't let it devour the rest of our budget, and at least put these companies under some scrutiny. So I think there's accountability measures, which Senator Warren is very good at, against price gouging. I think there's limits on the revolving door where members of Congress go and lobby for the companies. I think there's got to be uh, just a lot of pressure for Congress to be tougher, because well, like this year, if they cut 300 billion of Trump's 500 billion proposal, we're not really ahead of the game. But to really go after it, there was a member named Tom Andrews in Maine who was a friend of mine. And at the end of the Cold War, there was some talk of conversion. And there was a fund in the Clinton administration to fund alternatives. So the Aerospace Industry Association, well, arms sales are an alternative. Why don't we fund that? And Tom Andrews said, absolutely not. He also was one of the only members to say there was an excess military base in his state that he would support closing. Now, he took a lot of flack for that, and it wasn't a perfect test because he ran for Senate against Olympia Snowe, but he lost his seat. John Tierney, who runs Council for a Livable World, was in Raytheon country. He stood up to them quite often. Sarah Jacobs is in San Diego, which is eventually a floating naval base. She has made a lot of strong stands. Ro Khanna is from Silicon Valley. So it can be done, but we need critical mass, and I think we need both fiscal conservatives and also kind of middle of the road Democrats, because the thing about the system is it's not working for anybody. It's not working as a war fighting thing. It's not working as an investing in the country thing. It's just so broken. And in the 80s, there was a military reform caucus that included Newt Gingrich, among other people. 100 of them saying the weapons are too expensive, they're too brittle, they take too long to fix. This is bad for the warfighter. And Ben and I were on Newt Gingrich's podcast, and it was like I was in a parallel universe because he said everyone must read this book, meaning our book, because of the reform element that we can't keep building these exquisite weapons that are in the hangar half the time, and that we need a logical system where you align your purchases with your strategy. So he was the last person I expected to say that. And then the week before I was on Jon Stewart's show, he also, not surprisingly, was in agreement. So, but unfortunately, Newt Gingrich is not a force in the Republican Party anymore. But it was still an interesting exercise to see that. And Ben's been on some conservative podcasts talking about the deficit because this is all being paid for on our big national credit card while they cut taxes further, and that means our interest on the debt is now the largest item in the budget, except for Medicare and Social Security. It's even bigger than the Pentagon budget. So you can't not pay that, which means we're constricting what we have available for any other investment. Pentagon budget's going up, tax cuts, the interest on the debt. We're creating a garrison state, which is what Eisenhower warned against. And a few spin-offs from military tech is not going to cut it. If people can't get health care, they can't get decent housing, and they don't feel like they're part of a unified country, because there's a lot of division being sown in the interest of keeping us from having a more rational, humanistic approach. And so that veers into the cultural realm of it. But for example, the Poor People's Campaign, which is modeled on what Dr. King did at the end of his life, they want to trim back the war machine. They want to fight racism. They want to fight materialism. They want to fight white Christian nationalism, which is behind a lot of this. And they want to fight for environmental restoration. And they want to get more people at the bottom end of the income scale to vote. Most of them don't feel they have a stake. So I think all of that is going to happen. Also, the Pentagon spends money on Hollywood and gaming and just creating this idea. It's sort of like we're the lone gunman and we're going to come into town and all the bad guys are going to behave. Well, life doesn't work like that. But yet, for some people, it's almost that simple. And of course, American exceptionalism, more is better. More isn't better if you're using it to destroy countries and ruin your reputation in the world and cause unnecessary death and suffering. Like when Hegseth said, they asked him what the war would cost. He said, well, it costs a lot of money to kill bad guys. Well, was that those girls at the elementary school? Was that those people fleeing the hospitals where the nurses were taking kids out in incubators? I mean, it's just the rationales are so thin now. They really, unlike, George W. Bush, they bullied the intelligence community to come up with some paperwork. These folks are just doing it. And in fact, I almost don't need to research corruption anymore because they're just putting it in our face. There's people in this administration who are betting on when bombing is going to happen on the poly markets. Well, yeah, if you're in the Trump administration, you might well know that. So they're not doing 20 years and going to the contractors. They're cashing in now, which is obscene. And Senator Merkley has the bill to try to deal with that. But in the midst of all this chaos, it hasn't got the attention it deserves. So, and of course, Don Jr. is on the board of a drone company. Saudi Arabia invested in Jared Kushner's investment fund. And, there's the Trump class battleship, which is exactly what the Navy said we don't need. Big, beautiful target. So it's, I think people need to reckon with that. That, if you look at all their rationales, they become almost cartoonish. Except in this cartoon, people are still getting killed. And so then it comes back to, do you think, as a person in this country, you have the power to change it? And by yourself, you don't. But if you work with other people, if you build strength, if we build across movements, we can, because uh, so many people realize that we're headed in the wrong direction. But some of them are too discouraged to act. They don't know what to do. They're depressed. Well, the only way to figure it out is in motion. If we're working together, we'll figure it out. Like when I give a speech and somebody says, "Yeah, Bill, how do we fix this?" Well, I'm sitting at a dining room table in Manhattan, 70-year-old white dude, probably not the guy to come up with a strategy for the movement, but it'll be a collective undertaking with organizers, researchers, people on the front lines like the downwinders in New Mexico and Utah, workers on the line who would like a better way to make a living, scientists, renegades in Silicon Valley who don't want to build weapons, uh, you know, feminist foreign policy advocates who've been way ahead on all kinds of issues, from Palestine to what kind of society do we need to build. So somehow we have to come together and leave some of our lingering differences for a bit down the road, because it's a global emergency. So let's stop this drift to authoritarianism. Let's stop this push towards militarism. And then we can discuss all the other issues, and ideally in an attitude of tolerance and respect. And, that's not easy to do, but we have no choice.
Well,